Life of Mine Part 18. On the homeward journey, I touched at Prague, where I found my old friend Kittel, who had grown very much more corpulent, still in the most terrible fright about the riotous events which had taken place there. He seemed to be of opinion that the revolt of the Czech party against the Austrian government was directed at him personally, and he thought fit to reproach himself with the terrible agitation of the time, which he believed he had specially inflamed by his composition of my operatic text of Die Franzosen vor Nizza, out of which a kind of revolutionary air seemed to have become very popular. To my great pleasure, on my homeward journey I had the company of H. Nell the sculptor, whom I met on the steamer. There traveled with us also a Count Albert Nostitz, with whom he had just settled up his business concerning the statue of the Emperor Charles IV, and he was in the gayest mood, as the extremely insecure state of Austrian paper money had led to his being paid at a great profit to himself, in silver coin in accordance with his agreement. I was very pleased to find that, thanks to this circumstance, he was in such a confident mood, and so free from prejudice, that on arriving at Dresden he accompanied me the whole way a very long distance from the landing stage at which we had left the steamer to my house, in an open carriage, and this despite the fact that he very well knew that, only a few weeks before, I had caused a really terrible stir in this very city. As far as the public were concerned, the storm seemed quite to have died down, and I was able to resume my usual occupations and mode of life without any further trouble. I am sorry to say, however, that my old worries and anxieties started afresh. I stood in great need of money, and had not the vaguest notion whither to go in search of it. I then examined very thoroughly the answer I had received during the preceding winter to my petition for a higher salary. I had left it unread, as the modifications made in it had already disgusted me. If I had till now believed that it was Herr von Eltischow who had brought about the increase of salary I had demanded, in the shape of a supplement which I was to receive annually, in itself a humiliating thing, I now saw to my horror that all the time there had been no mention save of one single supplement, and that there was nothing to show that this should be repeated annually. On learning this, I saw that I should now be at the hopeless disadvantage of coming too late with a remonstrance if I should attempt to make one, so there was nothing left for me but to submit to an insult which, under the circumstances, was quite unprecedented. My feelings towards Herr von Eltischow, which shortly before had been rather warm owing to his supposed kind attitude towards me during the last disturbance, now underwent a serious change, and I soon had a new reason, actually connected with the above-mentioned affair, for altering my favorable opinion of him, and for turning finally against him for good and all. He had informed me that the members of the Imperial Orchestra had sent him a deputation demanding my instant dismissal, as they thought that it affected their honor to be any longer under a conductor who had compromised himself politically to the extent which I had. He also informed me that he had not only reprimanded them very severely, but that he had also been at great pains to pacify them concerning me. All this, which Eltischow had put in a highly favorable light, had latterly made me feel very friendly towards him. Then, however, as the result of inquiries into the matter, I heard accidentally through members of the orchestra that the facts of the case were almost exactly the reverse. What had happened was this, that the members of the Imperial Orchestra had been approached on all sides by the officials of the court and had been not only earnestly requested to do what Altashow had declared they had done of their own accord, but also threatened with the displeasure of the king and of incurring the strongest suspicion if they refused to comply. In order to protect themselves against this intrigue, and to avoid all evil consequences should they not take the required step, the musicians had turned to their principal and had sent him a deputation through which they declared that, as a corporation of artists, they did not in the least feel called upon to mix themselves up in a matter that did not concern them. Thus the halo with which my former attachment to Hervon Altashow had surrounded him at last disappeared for good and all, and it was chiefly my shame at having been so very much upset by his false conduct that now inspired me forever with such bitter feelings for this man. What determined this feeling even more than the insults I had suffered was the recognition of the fact that I was now utterly incapable of ever being able to enlist his influence in the cause of theatrical reform, which was so dear to me. It was natural that I should learn to attach ever less and less importance to the mere retention of the post of orchestral conductor on so extraordinarily inadequate and reduced a salary, and in keeping to this office, I merely bowed to what was an inevitable though purely accidental circumstance of a wretched fate. I did nothing to make the post more intolerable, but at the same time, I moved not a finger to ensure its permanence. The very next thing I must do was to attempt to establish my hopes of a larger income, so sadly doomed hitherto, upon a very much sounder basis. In this respect it occurred to me that I might consult my friend Liszt and beg him to suggest a remedy for my grievous position. And lo and behold, shortly after those fateful March days, and not long before the completion of my Lohengrin score, to my very great delight and astonishment, the very man I wanted walked into my room. He had come from Vienna, where he had lived through the barricade days, and he was going on to Weimar, where he intended to settle permanently. We spent an evening together at Schumann's, had a little music, and finally began a discussion on Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, in which Liszt and Schumann differed so fundamentally that the latter, completely losing his temper, retired in a fury to his bedroom for quite a long time. This incident did indeed place us in a somewhat awkward position towards our host, but it furnished us with a most amusing topic of conversation on the way home. I have seldom seen Liszt so extravagantly cheerful as on that night, when, in spite of the cold and the fact that he was clad only in ordinary evening dress, he accompanied first the music director Schubert and then myself to our respective homes. Subsequently, I took advantage of a few days' holiday in August to make an excursion to Weimar, where I found Liszt permanently installed and, as is well known, enjoying a life of most intimate intercourse with the Grand Duke. Even though he was unable to help me in my affairs, except by giving me a recommendation which finally proved useless, his reception of me on this short visit was so hearty and so exceedingly stimulating that it left me profoundly cheered and encouraged. On returning to Dresden, I tried as far as possible to curtail my expenses and to live within my means. And as every means of assistance failed me, I resorted to the expedient of sending out a circular letter addressed jointly to my remaining creditors, all of whom were really friends, and in this I told them frankly of my situation, and enjoined them to relinquish their demands for an indefinite time, till my affairs took a turn for the better, as without this I should certainly never be in a position to satisfy them. By this means they would, at all events, be in a position to oppose my general manager, whom I had every reason to suspect of evil designs, and who would have been only too glad to seize any signs of hostility towards me, on the part of my creditors, as a pretext for taking the worst steps against me. The assurance I required was given me unhesitatingly. My friend Pusinelli and Frau Klepperbein, an old friend of my motheress, even going so far as to declare that they were prepared to give up all claim to the money they had lent me. Thus, in some measure reassured, and with my position relative to Altishow so far improved that I could consult my own wishes as to whether, and when I should give up my post entirely, I now continued to fulfill my duties as a conductor as patiently and conscientiously as I was able, while with great zeal I also resumed my studies, which were carrying me ever further and further afield. Thus settled, I now began to watch the wonderful developments in the fate of my friend Arkell. As every day brought fresh rumors of threatened reactionary coups d'état and similar violent outbreaks, which Arkell thought it right to prevent, he drew up an appeal to the soldiers of the army of Saxony, in which he explained every detail of the cause for which he stood, and which he then had printed and distributed broadcast. This was too flagrant a misdeed for the public prosecutors. He was therefore immediately placed under arrest, and had to remain 3 days in jail while an action for high treason was lodged against him. He was only released when the solicitor Minkwitz stood bail for the requisite 3,000 marks, equal to L150. This return home to his anxious wife and children was celebrated by a little public festival, which the committee of the Vaterlandsverein had arranged in his honor, and the liberated man was greeted as the champion of the people's cause. On the other hand, however, the general management of the court theater, who had before suspended him temporarily, now gave him his final dismissal. Arkell let a full beard grow and began the publication of a popular journal called the Volksblatt, of which he was sole editor. He must have counted on its success to compensate him for the loss of his salary as musical director, for he at once hired an office in the Brudergasse for his undertaking. This paper succeeded in attracting the attention of a great many people to its editor, and showed up his talents in quite a new light. He never got involved in his style or indulged in any elaboration of words, but confined himself to matters of immediate importance and general interest. It was only after having discussed them in a calm and sober fashion that he led up from them to further deductions of still greater interest connected with them. The individual articles were short, and never contained anything superfluous, in addition to which they were so clearly written that they made an instructive and convincing appeal to the most uneducated mind. By always going to the root of things, instead of indulging in circumlocutions which, in politics have caused such great confusion in the minds of the uneducated masses, he soon had a large circle of readers, both among cultivated and uncultivated people. The only drawback was that the price of the little weekly paper was too small to yield him a corresponding profit. Moreover, it was necessary to warn him that if the reactionary party should ever come into power again, it could never possibly forgive him for this newspaper. His younger brother, Edward, who was paying a visit at the time in Dresden, declared himself willing to accept a post as piano teacher in England, which, though most uncongenial to him, would be lucrative and place him in a position to help Arkella's family if, as seemed probable, he met his reward in prison or on the gallows. Owing to his connection with various societies, his time was so much taken up that my intercourse with him was limited to walks, which became more and more rare. On these occasions, I often got lost in the most wildly speculative and profound discussions, while this wonderfully excitable man always remained calmly reflective and clear-headed. First and foremost, he had planned a drastic social reform of the middle classes as at present constituted by aiming at a complete alteration of the basis of their condition. He constructed a totally new moral order of things, founded on the teaching of Proudhon and other socialists regarding the annihilation of the power of capital by immediately productive labor, dispensing with the middleman. Little by little he converted me, by most seductive arguments, to his own views, to such an extent that I began to rebuild my hopes for the realization of my ideal in art upon them. Thus there were two questions which concerned me very nearly. He wished to abolish matrimony, in the usual acceptation of the word, altogether. I thereupon asked him what he thought the result would be of promiscuous intercourse with women of a doubtful character. With amiable indignation, he gave me to understand that we could have no idea about the purity of morals in general, and of the relations of the sexes in particular, so long as we were unable to free people completely from the yoke of the trades, guilds, and similar coercive institutions. He asked me to consider what the only motive would be which would induce a woman to surrender herself to a man, when not only the considerations of money, fortune, position, and family prejudices, but also the various influences necessarily arising from these, had disappeared. When I, in my turn, asked him whence he would obtain persons of great intellect and of artistic ability if everybody were to be merged in the working classes, he met my objection by replying that owing to the very fact that everybody would participate in the necessary labor according to his strength and capacity, work would cease to be a burden and would become simply an occupation which would finally assume an entirely artistic character. He demonstrated this on the principle that, as had already been proved, a field, worked laboriously by a single peasant, was infinitely less productive than when cultivated by several persons in a scientific way. These and similar suggestions, which Arkell communicated to me with a really delightful enthusiasm, led me to further reflections and gave birth to new plans upon which, to my mind, a possible organization of the human race, which would correspond to my highest ideals in art, could alone be based. In reference to this, I immediately turned my thoughts to what was close at hand and directed my attention to the theater. The motive for this came not only from my own feelings, but also from external circumstances. In accordance with the latest democratic suffrage laws, a general election seemed imminent in Saxony. The election of extreme radicals, which had now taken place nearly everywhere else, showed us that if the movement lasted, there would be the most extraordinary changes even in the administration of the revenue. Apparently, a general resolution had been passed to subject the civil list to a strict revision. All that was deemed superfluous in the royal household was to be done away with. The theater, as an unnecessary place of entertainment for a depraved portion of the public, was threatened with the withdrawal of the subsidy granted it from the civil list. I now resolved, in view of the importance which I attached to the theater, to suggest to the ministers that they should inform the members of Parliament that if the theater in its present condition were not worth any sacrifice from the state, it would sink to still more doubtful tendencies and might even become dangerous to public morals if deprived of that state control which had for its aim the ideal, and, at the same time, felt itself called upon to place culture and education under its beneficial protection. It was of the highest importance to me to secure an organization of the theater, which would make the carrying out its loftiest ideals not only a possibility, but also a certainty. Accordingly, I drew up a project by which the same sum as that which was allotted from the civil list for the support of a court theater should be employed for the foundation and upkeep of a national theater for the Kingdom of Saxony. In showing the practical nature of the well-planned particulars of my scheme, I defined them with such great precision that I felt assured my work would serve as a useful guide to the ministers as to how they should put this matter before Parliament. The point now was to have a personal interview with one of the ministers, and it occurred to me that the best man to apply to in the matter would be Hovonder Pforten, the Minister of Education. Although he already enjoyed the reputation of being a turncoat in politics and was said to be struggling to efface the origin of his political promotion, which had taken place at a time of great agitation, the mere fact of his having formerly been a professor was sufficient to make me suppose that he was a man with whom I could discuss the question that I had so much at heart. I learned, however, that the real art institutions of the kingdom, such, for instance, as the Academy of Fine Arts, to whose number I so ardently desired to see the theater added, belonged to the department of the Minister of the Interior. To this man the worthy, though not highly cultivated or artistic, Herr Oberlander, I submitted my plans, not, however, without having first made myself known to Hovonder Pforten, in order, for the reasons above stated, to command my project to him. This man, who apparently was very busy, received me in a polite and reassuring manner, but his whole bearing, indeed the very expression of his face, seemed to destroy all hopes I might ever have cherished of finding in him that understanding which I had expected. The Minister Oberlander, on the other hand, earned my confidence by the straightforward earnestness with which he promised a thorough inquiry into the matter. Unfortunately, however, at the same time, he informed me with the most simple frankness that he could entertain but very little hope of getting the king's authorization for any unusual treatment of a question hitherto given over to routine. It must be understood that the relations of the king to his ministers were both strained and unconfidential, and that this was more especially so in the case of Oberlander, who never approached the monarch on any other business than that which the strictest discharge of his current duties rendered indispensable. He therefore thought it would be better if my plan could be brought forward, in the first place, by the Chamber of Deputies, as, in the event of the new civil list being discussed, I was particularly anxious to avoid the question of the continuation of the court theatre being treated in the ignorant and short-sighted radical fashion, which was to be feared above all. I did not despair of making the acquaintance of some of the most influential among the new members of Parliament. In this wise I found myself suddenly plunged into quite a new and strange world, and became acquainted with persons and opinions, the very existence of which, until then, I had not even suspected. I found it somewhat trying always to be obliged to meet these gentlemen at their bier and shrouded in the dense clouds of their tobacco smoke, and to have to discuss with them matters which, though very dear to me, must have seemed a little fantastic to their mind. After a certain Herr von Truchler, a very handsome, energetic man, whose seriousness was almost gloomy, had listened to me calmly for some time, and had told me that he no longer knew anything about the state, but only about society, and that the latter would know, without either his or my aid, how it should act in regard to art and to the theatre. I was filled with such extraordinary feelings, half mingled with shame, that there and then I gave up not only all my exertions, but all my hopes as well. The only reminder I ever had of the whole affair came some while after when, on meeting Herr von Eltershow, I quickly gathered from his attitude to me that he had got wind of the episode, and that it only inspired him with fresh hostility towards me. During my walks, which I now took absolutely alone, I thought ever more deeply and much to the relief of my mind over my ideas concerning that state of human society for which the boldest hopes and efforts of the socialists and communists, then busily engaged in constructing their system, offered me but the roughest foundation. These efforts could have some meaning and value for me only when they had attained to that political revolution and reconstruction which they aimed at, for it was only then that I, in my turn, could start my reforms in art. At the same time my thoughts were busy with a drama in which the Emperor Frederick I, surnamed Barbarossa, was to be the hero. In it the model ruler was portrayed in a manner which lent him the greatest and most powerful significance. His dignified resignation at the impossibility of making his ideals prevail was intended not only to present a true transcript of the arbitrary multifariousness of the things of this world, but also to arouse sympathy for the hero. I wished to carry out this drama in popular rhyme, and in the style of the German used by our epic poets of the Middle Ages, and in this respect the poem Alexander, by the priest Lambert, struck me as a good example, but I never got further with this play than to sketch its outline in the broadest manner possible. The 5 acts were planned in the following manner. Act I, Imperial Diet in the Roncaglian Fields. a demonstration of the significance of imperial power which should extend even to the investiture of water and air. Act 2. The siege and capture of Milan. Act 3. Revolt of Henry the Lion and his overthrow at Lugano. Act 4. Imperial Diet in Augsburg. The humiliation and punishment of Henry the Lion. Act versus Imperial Diet and Grand Court Assembly at Mainz. Peace with the Lombards. Reconciliation with the Pope. Acceptance of the cross, and the departure for the East. I lost all interest, however, in the carrying out of this dramatic scheme. Directly I discovered its resemblance to the subject matter of the Nibelungen and Siegfried myths, which possessed a more powerful attraction for me. The points of similarity which I recognized between the history and the legend in question then induced me to write a treatise on the subject, and in this I was assisted by some stimulating monographs, found in the Royal Library, written by authors whose names have now escaped my memory, but which taught me in a very attractive manner a considerable amount about the old original kingdom of Germany. Later on I published this fairly extensive essay with the title of Die Nibelungen, but in working it out I finally lost all inclination to elaborate the historical material for a real drama. In direct connection with this I began to sketch a clear summary of the form which the old original Nibelungen myth had assumed in my mind in its immediate association with the mythological legend of the Godse form which, though full of detail, was yet much condensed in its leading features. Thanks to this work, I was able to convert the chief part of the material itself into a musical drama. It was only by degrees, however, and after long hesitation that I dared to enter more deeply into my plans for this work, for the thought of the practical realization of such a work on our stage literally appalled me. I must confess that it required all the despair which I then felt of ever having the chance of doing anything more for our theater, to give me the necessary courage to begin upon this new work. Until that time I simply allowed myself to drift, while I meditated listlessly upon the possibility of things pursuing their course further under the existing circumstances. In regard to Lohengrin, I had got to that point when I hoped for nothing more than the best possible production of it at the Dresden Theater, and felt that I should have to be satisfied in all respects and for all time if I were able to achieve even that. I had duly announced the completion of the score to Havon Eltashow, but in consideration of the unfavorable nature of my circumstances at the time, I had left it entirely to him to decide when my work should be produced. Meanwhile, the time arrived when the keeper of the archives of the Royal Orchestra called to mind that it was just 300 years since this royal institution had been founded, and that a jubilee would therefore have to be celebrated. To this end, a great concert festival was planned, the program of which was to be made up of the compositions of all the Saxon orchestral conductors that had lived since the institution had been founded. The whole body of musicians, with both their conductors at their head, were first to present their grateful homage to the king in Pillnitz, and on this occasion a musician was, for the first time, to be elevated to the rank of Knight of the Civil Order of Merit of Saxony. This musician was my colleague Reisiger. Until then he had been treated by the court, and by the manager himself, in the most scornful manner possible, but had, owing to his conspicuous loyalty at this critical time, especially to me, found exceptional favor in the eyes of our committees. When he appeared before the public decorated with the wonderful order, he was greeted with great jubilation by the loyal audience that filled the theater on the evening of the festival concert. His overture to Yelvo was also received with a perfect uproar of enthusiastic applause, such as had never fallen to his lot, whereas the finale of the first act from Lohengrin, which was produced as the work of the youngest conductor, was accorded only an indifferent reception. This was all the more strange as I was quite unaccustomed to such coolness in regard to my work on the part of the Dresden public. Following upon the concert, there was a festive supper, and when this was over, as all kinds of speeches were being made, I freely proclaimed to the orchestra, in a loud and decided tone, my views as to what was desirable for their perfection in the future. Hereupon Marskner, who, as a former musical conductor in Dresden, had been invited to the Jubilee celebrations, expressed the opinion that I should do myself a great deal of harm by holding too good an opinion of the musicians. He said I ought just to consider how uncultivated these people were with whom I had to deal. He pointed out that they were trained simply for the one instrument they played, and asked me whether I did not think that by discoursing to them on the aspirations of art I would produce not only confusion, but even perhaps bad blood. Far more pleasant to me than these festivities is the remembrance of the quiet memorial ceremony which united us on the morning of the Jubilee Day, with the object of placing wreaths on Weber's grave. As nobody could find a word to utter, and even Marskner was able to give expression only to the very driest and most trivial of speeches about the departed master, I felt it incumbent upon me to say a few heartfelt words concerning the memorial ceremony for which we were gathered together. This brief spell of artistic activity was speedily broken by fresh excitements, which kept pouring in upon us from the political world. The events of October in Vienna awakened our liveliest sympathy, and our walls daily blazed with red and black placards, with summonses to march on Vienna, with the curse of Red Monarchy, as opposed to the hated Red Republic, and with other equally startling matter. Except for those who were best informed as to the course of events and who certainly did not swarm in our streets, these occurrences aroused great uneasiness everywhere. With the entry of Windischgratz into Vienna, the acquittal of Froebel, and the execution of Blum, it seemed as though even Dresden were on the eve of an explosion. A vast demonstration of mourning was organized for Blum, with an endless procession through the streets. At the head marched the ministry, among whom the people were particularly glad to see von der Pforten taking a sympathetic share in the ceremony, as he had already become an object of suspicion to them. From that day gloomy forebodings of disaster grew ever more prevalent on every side. People even went so far as to say, with little attempt at circumlocution, that the execution of Blum had been an act of friendship on the part of the Archduchess Sophia to her sister, the Queen of Saxony, for during his agitation in Leipzig the man had made himself both hated and feared. Troops of Viennese fugitives, disguised as members of the student bands, began to arrive in Dresden, and made a formidable addition to its population, which from this time forth paraded the streets with ever-increasing confidence. One day, as I was on my way to the theater to conduct a performance of Rienzi, the choir master informed me that several foreign gentlemen had been asking for me. Thereupon 6 persons presented themselves, greeted me as a brother Democrat, and begged me to procure them free entrance tickets. Among them I recognized a former dabbler in literature, a man named Hafner, a little hunchback, in a Calabrian hat cocked at a terrific angle, to whom I had been introduced by Yule on the occasion of my visit to the Vienna Political Club. Great as was my embarrassment at this visit, which evidently astonished our musicians, I felt in no wise compelled to make any compromising admission, but quietly went to the booking office, took 6 tickets, and handed them to my strange visitors, who parted from me before all the world with much hearty shaking of hands. Whether this evening call improved my position as musical conductor in Dresden in the minds of the theatrical officials and others may well be doubted, but at all events, on no occasion was I so frantically called for after every act as at this particular performance of Rienzi. Indeed, at this time I seemed to have won over to my side a party of almost passionate adherents among the theater-going public, in opposition to the clique which had shown such marked coldness on the occasion of the gala concert already mentioned. It mattered not whether Tannhäuser or Rienzi were being played, I was always greeted with special applause, and although the political tendencies of this party may have given our management some cause for alarm, yet it forced them to regard me with a certain amount of awe. One day Altschuh proposed to have my Lohengrin performed at an early date. I explained my reasons for not having offered it to him before, but declared myself ready to further his wishes, as I considered the opera company was now sufficiently powerful. The son of my old friend, F. Heine, had just returned from Paris, where he had been sent by the Dresden management to study scene painting under the artists Desplechin and Dieterle, by way of testing his powers, with a view to an engagement at the Dresden Royal Theatre. The task of preparing suitable scenery for this opera was entrusted to him. He had already asked permission to do this for Lohengrin at the instigation of Altschuh, who wished to call attention to my latest work. Consequently, when I gave my consent, young Heine's wish was granted. I regarded this turn of events with no little satisfaction, believing that in the study of this particular work I should find a wholesome and effective diversion from all the excitement and confusion of recent events. My horror, therefore, was all the greater when young Wilhelm Heine one day came to my room with the news that the scenery for Lohengrin had been suddenly countermanded and instructions given him to prepare for another opera. I did not make any remark, nor ask the reason for this singular behavior. The assurances which Ludwigin afterwards made to my wife, if they were really true, made me regret having laid the chief blame for this mortification at his door, and having thereby irrevocably alienated my sympathy from him. When she asked him about this many years later, he assured her that he had found the court vehemently hostile to me, and that his well-meant attempts to produce my work had met with insuperable obstacles. However that may have been, the bitterness I now experienced wrought a decisive effect upon my feelings. Not only did I relinquish all hope of a reconciliation with the theater authorities by a splendid production of my Lohengrin, but I determined to turn my back forever on the theater and to make no further attempt to meddle with its concerns. By this act, I expressed not merely my utter indifference as to whether I kept my position as musical conductor or no, but my artistic ambitions also entirely cut me off from all possibility of ever cultivating modern theatrical conditions again. I once proceeded to execute my long-cherished plans for Siegfried Tod, which I had been half afraid of before. In this work I no longer gave a thought to the Dresden or any other court theater in the world. My sole preoccupation was to produce something that should free me, once and for all, from this irrational subservience. As I could get nothing more from Arkell in this connection, I now corresponded exclusively with Edouard de Vriend on matters connected with the theater and dramatic art. When, on the completion of my poem, I read it to him, he listened with amazement and at once realized the fact that such a production would be an absolute drug in the modern theatrical market, and he naturally could not agree to let it remain so. On the other hand, he tried so far to reconcile himself to my work as to try and make it less startling and more adapted for actual production. He proved the sincerity of his intentions by pointing out my error in asking too much of the public and requiring it to supply from its own knowledge many things necessary for a right understanding of my subject matter, at which I had only hinted in brief and scattered suggestions. He showed me, for instance, that before Siegfried and Brunhilde are displayed in a position of bitter hostility towards each other, they ought first to have been presented in their true and calmer relationship. I had, in fact, opened the poem of Siegfried's Theody with those scenes which now form the first act of the Götterdämmerung. The details of Siegfried's relation to Brunhilde had been merely outlined to the listeners in a lyrico-episodical dialogue between the hero's wife, whom he had left behind in solitude, and a crowd of Valkyries passing before her rock. To my great joy, De Vriend's hint on this point directed my thoughts to those scenes which I afterwards worked out in the prologue of this drama. This and other matters of a similar nature brought me into intimate contact with Edouard de Vriend, and made our intercourse much more lively and pleasant. He often invited a select circle of friends to attend dramatic readings at his house, in which I gladly took part, for I found, to my surprise, that his gift for declamation, which quite forsook him on the stage, here stood out in strong relief. It was, moreover, a consolation to pour into a sympathetic ear my worries about my growing unpopularity with the director. De Vriend seemed particularly anxious to prevent a definite breach, but of this there was little hope. With the approach of winter, the court had returned to town and once more frequented the theater, and various signs of dissatisfaction in high quarters with my behavior as conductor began to be manifested. On one occasion the Queen thought that I had conducted Norma badly, and on another that I had taken the time wrongly in Robert the Devil. As Loettich had to communicate these reprimands to me, it was natural that our intercourse at such times should hardly be of a nature to restore our mutual satisfaction with each other. Notwithstanding all this, it still seemed possible to prevent matters from coming to a crisis, though everything continued in a state of agitating uncertainty and fermentation. At all events, the forces of reaction, which were holding themselves in readiness on every side, were not yet sufficiently certain that the hour of their triumph had come as not to consider it advisable for the present, at least, to avoid all provocation. Consequently, our management did not meddle with the musicians of the Royal Orchestra, who, in obedience to the spirit of the times, had formed a union for debate and the protection of their artistic and civic interests. In this matter, one of our youngest musicians, Theodore Uhlig, had been particularly active. He was a young man, still in his early 20s, and was a violinist in the orchestra. His face was strikingly mild, intelligent and noble, and he was conspicuous among his fellows on account of his great seriousness and his quiet but unusually firm character. He had particularly attracted my notice on several occasions by his quick insight and extensive knowledge of music. As I recognized in him a spirit keenly alert in every direction and unusually eager for culture, it was not long before I chose him as my companion in my regular walks, a habit I still continued to cultivate and on which Reckel had hitherto accompanied me. He induced me to come to a meeting of this union of the orchestral company in order that I might form an opinion about it and encourage and support so praiseworthy a movement. On this occasion, I communicated to its members the contents of my memorandum to the director, which had been rejected a year before, and in which I had made suggestions for reforms in the band, and I also explained further intentions and plans arising therefrom. At the same time, I was obliged to confess that I had lost all hope of carrying out any projects of the kind through the general management, and must therefore recommend them to take the initiative vigorously into their own hands. They acclaimed the idea with enthusiastic approval. Although, as I have said before, Luedicha left these musicians unmolested in their more or less democratic union, yet he took care to be informed through spies of what took place at their highly treasonable gatherings. His chief instrument was a bugler named Louis, who, much to the disgust of all his comrades in the orchestra, was in particularly high favor with the director. He consequently received precise, or rather exaggerated, accounts of my appearance there, and thought it was now high time to let me once more feel the weight of his authority. I was officially summoned to his presence, and had to listen to a long and wrathful tirade which he had been bottling up for some time about several matters. I also learned that he knew all about the plan of theater reform which I had laid before the ministry. This knowledge he betrayed in a popular Dresden phrase, which until then I had never heard. He knew very well, he said, that in a memorandum respecting the theater I had made him look ridiculous, ihm in den Laden gelegt. In answer to this, I did not refrain from telling him how I intended to act in retaliation, and when he threatened to report me to the king and demand my dismissal, I calmly replied that he might do as he pleased, as I was well assured that I could rely on His Majesty's justice to hear, not only his charges, but also my defense. Moreover, I added, This was the only befitting manner for me to discuss with the king the many points on which I had to complain, not only in my own interests, but also in those of the theater and of art. This was not pleasant hearing for El to show, and he asked how it was possible for him to try and cooperate with me, when I for my part had openly declared, to use his own expression, that all labor was wasted upon him. Hopfen und mals verloren seen. We had at last to part with mutual shruggings of the shoulder. My conduct seemed to trouble my former patron, and he therefore enlisted the tact and moderation of Edouard de Vriant in his service, and asked him to use his influence with me to facilitate some further arrangement between us. But, in spite of all his zeal, de Vriant had to admit with a smile, after we had discussed his message, that nothing much could be done, and as I persisted in my refusal to meet the director again in consultation respecting the service of the theater, he had at last to recognize that his own wisdom would have to help him out of the difficulty. Throughout the whole period during which I was fated to fill the post of conductor at Dresden, the effects of this dislike on the part of the court and the director continued to make themselves felt in everything. The orchestral concerts, which had been organized by me in the previous winter, were this year placed under Reisiger's control, and at once sank to the usual level of ordinary concerts. Public interest quickly waned, and the undertaking could only with difficulty be kept alive. In opera, I was unable to carry out the proposed revival of the Fliegender Holländer, for which I had found in Mitterwurzeres mature talent an admirable and promising exponent. My niece Johanna, whom I had destined for the part of Senta, did not like the role, because it offered little opportunity for splendid costumes. She preferred Zampa and Favorita, partly to please her new protector, my erstwhile Rienzi enthusiast, Tykic, partly for the sake of 3 brilliant costumes which the management had to furnish for each of these parts. In fact, these 2 ringleaders of the Dresden Opera of that day had formed an alliance of rebellion against my vigorous rule in the matter of operatic repertoire. Their opposition, to my great discomfiture, was crowned by success when they secured the production of this Favorita of Donizetti's, the arrangement of which I had once been obliged to undertake for Schlesinger in Paris. I had at first emphatically refused to have anything to do with this opera, although its principal part suited my niece's voice admirably, even in her father's judgment. But now that they knew of my feud with the director, and of my voluntary loss of influence, and finally of my evident disgrace, they thought the opportunity ripe for compelling me to conduct this tiresome work myself, as it happened to be my turn. Besides this, my chief occupation at the Royal Theatre during this period consisted in conducting Flottau's opera Martha, which, although it failed to attract the public, was nevertheless produced with excessive frequency, owing to its convenient cast. On reviewing the results of my labors in Dresden, where I had now been nearly 7 years, I could not help feeling humiliated when I considered the powerful and energetic impetus I knew I had given in many directions to the court theater, and I found myself obliged to confess that, were I now to leave Dresden, not the smallest trace of my influence would remain behind. From various signs I also gathered that, if ever it should come to a trial before the king between the director and myself, even if his majesty were in my favor, yet out of consideration for the courtier the verdict would go against me. Nevertheless, on Palm Sunday of the new year, 1849, I received ample amends. In order to ensure liberal receipts, our orchestra had again decided to produce Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Everyone did his utmost to make this one of our finest performances, and the public took up the matter with real enthusiasm. Michael Bakunin, unknown to the police, had been present at the public rehearsal. At its close, he walked unhesitatingly up to me in the orchestra and said in a loud voice that if all the music that had ever been written were lost in the expected worldwide conflagration, we must pledge ourselves to rescue this symphony, even at the peril of our lives. Not many weeks after this performance, it really seemed as though this worldwide conflagration would actually be kindled in the streets of Dresden, and that Bakunin, with whom I had meanwhile become more closely associated through strange and unusual circumstances, would undertake the office of chief stoker. It was long before this date that I first made the acquaintance of this most remarkable man. For years I had come across his name in the newspapers, and always under extraordinary circumstances. He turned up in Paris at a Polish gathering, but although he was a Russian, he declared that it mattered little whether a man were a Russian or a Pole, so long as he wanted to be a free man, and that this was all that mattered. I heard afterwards, through George Herweg, that he had renounced all his sources of income as a member of an influential Russian family, and that one day, when his entire fortune consisted of 2 francs, he had given them away to a beggar on the boulevard, because it was irksome to him to be bound by this possession to take any thought for the morrow. I was informed of his presence in Dresden one day by Arkel, after the latter had become a rampant Republican. He had taken the Russian into his house and invited me to come and make his acquaintance. Bakunin was at that time being persecuted by the Austrian government for his share in the events which took place in Prague in the summer of 1848, and because he was a member of the Slav Congress, which had preceded them. He had consequently sought refuge in our city, as he did not wish to settle too far from the Bohemian frontier. The extraordinary sensation he had created in Prague arose from the fact that, when the Czechs sought the protection of Russia against the dreaded Germanising policy of Austria, he conjured them to defend themselves with fire and sword against those very Russians, and indeed against any other people who lived under the rule of a despotism like that of the Tsars. This superficial acquaintance with voluminous aims had sufficed to change the purely national prejudices of the Germans against him into sympathy. When I met him, therefore, under the humble shelter of Arkel's roof, I was immediately struck by his singular and altogether imposing personality. He was in the full bloom of manhood, anywhere between 30 and 40 years of age. Everything about him was colossal, and he was full of a primitive exuberance and strength. I never gathered that he set much store by my acquaintance. Indeed, he did not seem to care for merely intellectual men. What he demanded was men of reckless energy. As I afterwards perceived, theory in this case had more weight with him than purely personal sentiment, and he talked much and expatiated freely on the matter. His general mode of discussion was the Socratic method, and he seemed quite at his ease when, stretched on his hostess' hard sofa, he could argue discursively with a crowd of all sorts of men on the problems of revolution. On these occasions, he invariably got the best of the argument. It was impossible to triumph against his opinions, stated as they were with the utmost conviction, and overstepping in every direction even the extremest bounds of radicalism. So communicative was he, that on the very first evening of our meeting, he gave me full details about the various stages of his development. He was a Russian officer of high birth, but smarting under the yoke of the narrowest martial tyranny. He had been led by a study of Rousseau's writings to escape to Germany under pretense of taking furlough. In Berlin, he had flung himself into the study of philosophy with all the zest of a barbarian newly awakened to civilization. Hegel's philosophy was the one which was the rage at that moment, and he soon became such an expert in it that he had been able to hurl that master's most famous disciples from the saddle of their own philosophy in a thesis couched in terms of the strictest Hegelian dialectic. After he had got philosophy off his chest, as he expressed it, he proceeded to Switzerland, where he preached communism, and thence wandered over France and Germany back to the borderland of the Slav world, from which quarter he looked for the regeneration of humanity, because the Slavs had been less enervated by civilization. His hopes in this respect were centered in the more strongly pronounced Slav type characteristic of the Russian peasant class. In the natural detestation of the Russian serf for his cruel oppressor the nobleman, he believed he could trace a substratum of simple-minded brotherly love, and that instinct which leads animals to hate the men who hunt them. In support of this idea, he cited the childish, almost demoniac delight of the Russian people in fire, a quality on which Rostopchin calculated in his strategic burning of Moscow. He argued that all that was necessary to set in motion a worldwide movement was to convince the Russian peasant, in whom the natural goodness of oppressed human nature had preserved its most childlike characteristics, that it was perfectly right and well-pleasing to God for them to burn their lords' castles, with everything in and about them. The least that could result from such a movement would be the destruction of all those things which, rightly considered, must appear, even to Europe's most philosophical thinkers, the real source of all the misery of the modern world. To set these destructive forces in action appeared to him the only object worthy of a sensible man's activity. Even while he was preaching these horrible doctrines, Bakunin, noticing that my eyes troubled me, shielded them with his outstretched hand from the naked light for a full hour, in spite of my protestations. This annihilation of all civilization was the goal upon which his heart was set. Meanwhile, it amused him to utilize every lever of political agitation he could lay hands on for the advancement of this aim, and in so doing he often found cause for ironical merriment. In his retreat, he received people belonging to every shade of revolutionary thought. Nearest to him stood those of Slav nationality, because these, he thought, would be the most convenient and effective weapons he could use in the uprooting of Russian despotism. In spite of their republic and their socialism à la Proudhon, he thought nothing of the French, and as for the Germans, he never mentioned them to me. Democracy, republicanism, and anything else of the kind he regarded as unworthy of serious consideration. Every objection raised by those who had the slightest wish to reconstruct what had been demolished, he met with overwhelming criticism. I well remember on one occasion that a Pole, startled by his theories, maintained that there must be an organized state to guarantee the individual in the possession of the fields he had cultivated. "What," he answered, "would you carefully fence in your field to provide a livelihood for the police again?" This shut the mouth of the terrified Pole. He comforted himself by saying that the creators of the new order of things would arise of themselves, but that our sole business in the meantime was to find the power to destroy. Was any one of us so mad as to fancy that he would survive the desired destruction? We ought to imagine the whole of Europe with St. Petersburg, Paris, and London transformed into a vast rubbish heap. How could we expect the kindlers of such a fire to retain any consciousness after so vast a devastation? He used to puzzle any who professed their readiness for self-sacrifice by telling them it was not the so-called tyrants who were so obnoxious, but the smug Philistines. As a type of these, he pointed to a Protestant parson and declared that he would not believe he had really reached the full stature of a man until he saw him commit his own parsonage, with his wife and child, to the flames. I was all the more perplexed for a while, in the face of such dreadful ideas, by the fact that Bakunin in other respects proved a really amiable and tender-hearted man. He was fully alive to my own anxiety and despair with regard to the risk I ran of forever destroying my ideals and hopes for the future of art. It is true, he declined to receive any further instruction concerning these artistic schemes, and would not even look at my work on the Nibelungen saga. I had just then been inspired by a study of the Gospels to conceive the plan of a tragedy for the ideal stage of the future, entitled Jesus of Nazareth. Bakunin begged me to spare him any details, and when I sought to win him over to my project by a few verbal hints, he wished me luck, but insisted that I must at all costs make Jesus appear as a weak character. As for the music of the piece, he advised me, amid all the variations, to use only one set of phrases, namely, for the tenor, off with his head, for the soprano, hang him, and for the basso continuo, fire. Fire. And yet I felt more sympathetically drawn towards this prodigy of a man when I one day induced him to hear me play and sing the first scenes of my Fliegender Holländer. After listening with more attention than most people gave, he exclaimed, during a momentary pause, "That is stupendously fine," and wanted to hear more. As his life of permanent concealment was very dull, I occasionally invited him to spend an evening with me. For supper my wife set before him finely cut slices of sausage and meat, which he at once devoured wholesale, instead of spreading them frugally on his bread in Saxon fashion. Noticing Minna's alarm at this, I was guilty of the weakness of telling him how we were accustomed to consume such viands, whereupon he reassured me with a laugh, saying that it was quite enough, only he would like to eat what was set before him in his own way. I was similarly astonished at the manner in which he drank wine from our ordinary-sized small glasses. As a matter of fact, he detested wine, which only satisfied his craving for alcoholic stimulants in such paltry, prolonged, and subdivided doses, whereas a stiff glass of brandy, swallowed at a gulp, at once produced the same result, which, after all, was only temporarily attained. Above all, he scorned the sentiment which seeks to prolong enjoyment by moderation, arguing that a true man should only strive to still the cravings of nature, and that the only real pleasure in life worthy of a man was love. These and other similar little characteristics showed clearly that in this remarkable man the purest impulses of an ideal humanity conflicted strangely with a savagery entirely inimical to all civilization, so that my feelings during my intercourse with him fluctuated between involuntary horror and irresistible attraction. I frequently called for him to share my lonely wanderings. This he gladly did, not only for the sake of necessary bodily exercise, but also because he could do so in this part of the world without fear of meeting his pursuers. My attempts during our conversations to instruct him more fully regarding my artistic aims remained quite unavailing as long as we were unable to quit the field of mere discussion. All these things seemed to him premature. He refused to admit that out of the very needs of the evil present all laws for the future would have to be evolved, and that these, moreover, must be molded upon quite different ideas of social culture. Seeing that he continued to urge destruction, and again destruction, I had at last to inquire how my wonderful friend proposed to set this work of destruction in operation. It then soon became clear, as I had suspected it would, and as the event soon proved, that with this man of boundless activity everything rested upon the most impossible hypotheses. Doubtless I, with my hopes of a future artistic remodeling of human society, appeared to him to be floating in the barren air, yet it soon became obvious to me that his assumptions as to the unavoidable demolition of all the institutions of culture were at least equally visionary. My first idea was that Bakunin was the center of an international conspiracy, but his practical plans seem originally to have been restricted to a project for revolutionizing Prague, where he relied merely on a union formed among a handful of students. Believing that the time had now come to strike a blow, he prepared himself one evening to go there. This proceeding was not free from danger, and he set off under the protection of a passport made out for an English merchant. First of all, however, with the view of adapting himself to the most Philistine culture, he had to submit his huge beard and bushy hair to the tender mercies of the razor and shears. As no barber was available, Arkell had to undertake the task. A small group of friends watched the operation, which had to be executed with a dull razor, causing no little pain, under which none but the victim himself remained passive. We bade farewell to Bakunin with the firm conviction that we should never see him again alive. But in a week he was back once more, as he had realized immediately what a distorted account he had received as to the state of things in Prague, where all he found ready for him was a mere handful of childish students. These admissions made him the butt of Arkell's good-humored chaff, and after this he won the reputation among us of being a mere revolutionary, who was content with theoretical conspiracy. Very similar to his expectations from the Prague students were his presumptions with regard to the Russian people. These also afterwards proved to be entirely groundless and based merely on gratuitous assumptions drawn from the supposed nature of things. I consequently found myself driven to explain the universal belief in the terrible dangerousness of this man by his theoretical views, as expressed here and elsewhere, and not as arising from any actual experience of his practical activity. But I was soon to become almost an eyewitness of the fact that his personal conduct was never for a moment swayed by prudence, such as one is accustomed to meet in those whose theories are not seriously meant. This was shortly to be proved in the momentous insurrection of May, 1849.